Peace everybody, back with another video. He spent 20 years in prison for a double murder he didn't commit. DNA evidence exonerated him. Yeah, so now you got a guy who has spent 20 years in prison for a double murder he did not commit. And of course the DNA has the evidence to prove it, and they exonerated him. So I'm assuming this guy right here is the one who spent 20 years in prison. On March 11th, 1985, Harold and Thelma Swain were leading a Bible study at the Rising Daughter Baptist Church, a predominantly black church where Harold was a deacon in Waverly, Georgia. At some point during the study, a white man entered the church and murdered the Swains. Witnesses were able to briefly see the murderer, but their descriptions were not that helpful to law enforcement. Yeah, so this happened on March 11th, and this was in the year of 1985. Harold and Thelma Swain were leading a Bible study at the Rising Daughter Baptist Church. It is a predominantly black church where Harold was a deacon in Waverly, Georgia. At some point during the study, there was a white man who entered the church and murdered the Swains. And of course, there was witnesses were able to briefly see the murderer, but their descriptions were not that helpful to law enforcement. 3 years later, lead investigators, Georgia Bureau of Investigations agent Joe Gregory and Camden County Sheriff Deputy Butch Kennedy were still trying to figure out who murdered the Swains. The name Dennis Perry was among the hundreds of suspects in the shooting, but the investigators were able to rule him out as a suspect because he had an alibi. He was working in the Atlanta area at the time of the shooting. A key witness was unable to pick Perry's photo out of a lineup to identify him as the shooter. So, and of course, now we got 3 years later, leading investigators, Georgia Bureau of Investigations agent Joe Gregory and Camden County Sheriff Deputy Butch Kennedy were still trying to figure out who murdered the Swains. They figured, well, the name Dennis Perry was among the hundreds of suspects in the shooting, but the investigators were able to rule him out as a suspect. So they kind of figured, well, this is not the guy, because he had an alibi. So he's told them where they were, or he was working in the Atlanta area at the time of the shooting. The key witness was unable to pick Perry's photo out of a lineup to identify him as the shooter, so they couldn't identify him. So they kind of figured, well, this is not the guy. The murders went cold and were even featured on popular television shows like Unsolved Mysteries and Crime Watch. Hundreds of tips flowed in, but the case still went cold in 1998. 13 years after the shooting, Camden County Sheriff Bill Smith made a stunning decision. He promised former Deputy Dale Bundy a job if Bundy could solve the cold case. And so the murders went cold for years, and were even featured on popular television shows like Unsolved Mysteries, Crime Watch, and hundreds of tips did fly in, but the case still went cold. And of course, now, the year 1998, 13 years after the shooting, Camden County Sheriff Bill Smith made a stunning decision. He promised former Deputy Dale Bundy a job if Bundy could solve the cold case. So that's what he promised Dale Bundy, if he could solve the case. Bundy immediately zeroed in on Perry, according to the Georgia Innocence Project, due primarily to the testimony of Jan Beaver, the mother of Perry's ex-girlfriend. By pointing the finger at Perry, Beaver sought a reward of $25,000 for her information. She eventually received $12,000 to testify against Perry, but this payment was never disclosed to Perry's defense attorneys. So Bundy immediately zeroed in on Perry, according to the Georgia Innocence Project. It was due primarily to the testimony of Jane Beaver, the mother of Perry's ex-girlfriend. By pointing the finger at Perry, Beaver did sought a reward of $25,000 for her information. So whatever information she gave out, she must have lied about it. She eventually received $12,000 to testify against Perry, but this payment was never disclosed to Perry's defense attorneys. So they never disclosed the payments or anything. 18 years after the murders, the state seeking a death sentence prosecuted Perry in a trial characterized by unreliable evidence and prosecutorial misconduct, the GIP said in a press release after the jury convicted Perry. Assistant District Attorney John Johnson offered Perry a deal. If Perry waived his rights to file a direct appeal, Johnson would ensure he would not be executed. Perry agreed and in turn received two consecutive life sentence in prison. So Perry had ended up doing 2 consecutive life sentences in prison for something he did not do and that somebody else did. And this happened 18 years after the murders. The state seeking a death sentence prosecuted Perry in a trial characterized by unreliable evidence and prosecutorial misconduct. And this is what the GIP said in a press release. The jury convicted Perry. Assistant District Attorney John Johnson offered Perry a deal. So Perry had no choice but to waive his rights to file a direct appeal. Johnson would assure he would not be executed. Perry agreed and in turn received 2 consecutive life sentences in prison. So he would have to spend the rest of his life in prison for a murder he did not commit. The years ticked by as Perry fought to prove his innocence from prison, and the Georgia Innocence Project accepted and worked on his case, ultimately recruiting King and Spalding as co-counsel. The case received renewed media attention in 2018 as the focus of Undisclosed podcast's 3rd season, in which dedicated reports thoroughly reinvestigated the case, distilling thousands of pages and hundreds of suspects into a few promising leads. Building on that, a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution then honed in on one suspect in particular after uncovering that his original alibi had been fabricated. GIP investigator Ron Gross then collected DNA evidence from a relative of that suspect, which was then matched the evidence from the crime scene. So you get the years went by. Perry fought to prove his innocence from prison, and the Georgia Innocence Project accepted and worked on his case. So they kept working on his case, even though he was sent to prison for something he did not do. But they kind of figured, well, so the Georgia Innocence Project, they accepted the work and they went to work on his case ultimately recruiting King and Spalding as co-counsel. So all three of them, all of them had worked together to solve who killed the Swains. The case revealed renewed media attention in 2018 as the focus of Undisclosed Podcast's third season, in which dedicated reporters thoroughly reinvestigated the case, distilling thousands of pages and hundreds of suspects. So you know they had to go and re-interview everybody, reading thousands of pages into a few promising leads building on that. There was a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that honed in on one suspect in particular after uncovering that his original alibi had been fabricated. The GPI investigator, Ron Gross, then collected DNA evidence from a relative of that suspect, which was then matched to evidence from the crime scene. So they had to go to the crime scene, collect the DNA, so this way they'll know who it was. Last year, the GIP and King and Spalding presented all this to the Brunswick Judicial Circuit District Attorney Jackie Johnson, who refused to grant Perry a new trial. Instead, Johnson asked the Georgia Bureau of Investigations to reopen its investigation into the murders of Harold and Thelma Swain. Yes, so last year the GPI, along with the King and Spalding, presented all this to the Brunswick Judicial Circuit District Attorney Jackie Johnson, who didn't want nothing to do with it, and of course to refuse Perry a new trial. Johnson asked the Georgia Bureau of Investigations to reopen its investigation into the murders of Harold and Thelma Swain. So Jackie didn't want to give Perry a new trial, but now that Jackie is asking the Georgia Bureau of Investigations to reopen its investigation into the murders of Harold and Thelma Swain, Perry's defense team filed an extraordinary motion for a new trial. Johnson, the original trial prosecutor, and a contract attorney fought against the motion. Brunswick Traditional Circuit Superior Court Judge Stephen Scarlett granted and ordered Perry to be released from prison on his own recognizance to wait Johnson's decision whether to hold a new trial or dismiss the charges against Perry. So Perry's defense team did file an extraordinary motion for a new trial. Johnson, the original prosecutor, and a contract attorney fought against it. They said, no, we don't want this new trial. Just please leave it closed. But they fought against the motion. And of course, the judge had to step in and granted and ordered Perry to be released from prison on his own recognizance to wait Johnson's decisions whether to hold a new trial or dismiss it. Charges against Perry. It has been a year since Perry was released from prison, and on Monday, Judge Scarlett granted Brunswick Judicial Circuit District Attorney Keith Higgins' motion to dismiss the charges against Perry, officially exonerating a man who spent 20 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And so Perry had spent 20 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And of course, it's been a year since Perry was released from prison. By the time Monday came around, Judge Scarlett granted Brunswick Judicial District Attorney Keith Higgins' motion to dismiss the charges against Perry, officially exonerating a man who spent 20 years in prison. So now that Perry is out, all his charges are dismissed. There was no way he did anything wrong. He never commit murder, nothing, or anything like that. So the former attorney never even appealed the case or did nothing. It took a long time, but I never gave up, Perry said in the GIP's press release. I knew that eventually someone else would see the truth, and I'm so grateful to the Georgia Innocence Project and King and Spaulding for bringing the truth to light. This indictment has been hanging over my head for over 20 years. It is such a relief to finally not have to worry about being accused of this awful thing. Yeah, so it has been a very long time for Perry, because he never gave up. He knew the truth, that he never did anything wrong, and of course the courts, they refused to believe him, so they kind of figured, well, we'll just throw him in prison for the rest of his life, and that's what they did. And then for 20 years, Perry had this hanging over his head. And of course, it was a relief to finally not have to worry about being accused of this awful thing. So he went through a lot to prove his innocence. And now that Perry is out, he can sue the court, and he can sue the attorney, the former attorney, for all this trouble that they have caused him. Because it took 20 years just to prove his innocence. And when the GIP finally stepped in, along with King and Spaulding, they knew that he was innocent. And then the judge had dismissed all the charges against him. So this is a good thing that Perry is out of prison. He doesn't have to go back there anymore. So this is how you could do things the right way, is prove your innocence. And of course, this man had never did anything wrong at all. Now that he's free, he could be happy again. But of course, like I said, he'll end up suing the court and the former district attorney, or the former attorney, for all this mess that they created on him for something he didn't do. Leave your comments below. I am out.